19 years of building an empire from the polished mahogany bones of this boardroom, reduced to a single, mocking smirk. The mahogany table still held the faint heat of my laptop, but the chair belonged to a ghost who hadn't earned his shadow. Nepotism tastes like cheap champagne, bubbly, expensive, and utterly hollow. They thought they were emptying an office, but they had just unlocked the vault. The silence in the boardroom didn't just hang, it suffocated. It was the heavy, expensive kind of silence that only exists in corner offices on the 40th floor, where the carpet is thick enough to swallow footsteps and the glass windows look out over a city that looks like a playground for gods. Arthur Vance, the CEO, didn't look me in the eye. He adjusted his gold cufflinks with the meticulous focus of a surgeon preparing for an incision, though his hands were slightly too stiff to carry the illusion. Next to him sat Julian,
26 years old, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my first car, and sporting a smile that had never known the friction of hard work. "It's just a realignment of vision," Arthur said, his voice smooth, practiced, and thoroughly rehearsed with HR. "The board feels we need a more contemporary perspective to drive the next fiscal cycle." Julian has been shadowing the tech acquisition division for months. Shadowing was a generous term for spending 3 hours a week hungover in a corner office, ordering artisanal lattes on the company dime. I looked at the mahogany table, the very table where I had stayed up until 3 a.m. drafting the logistics framework that saved this company from bankruptcy during the 2018 crash. 19 years of my life, digitized into spreadsheets and burned into the foundation of this firm, dismissed like yesterday's lunch order. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. The gesture was deliberately informal, a calculated display of ownership. He tapped his fingers against the glass surface of his brand new iPad. "Don't take it personally, old man," Julian smirked, his eyes gleaming with the toxic thrill of unearned power. "The market changes. Time to make room for family." The word family felt dirty leaving his mouth. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my hands on the table. When you spend 2 decades navigating corporate minefields, you learn that anger is a currency you never spend in front of your enemies. Instead, I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and gave them a small, tight nod. "I wish you the best of luck with the upcoming compliance audit," I said softly. Julian laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "We have the best lawyers in the city. I think we can handle a little paperwork." He had no idea. He didn't know that the entire framework of the new government contract rested not on the company's infrastructure, but on the security clearance tied directly to my social security number and my personal signature. I walked out of the boardroom, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me with a sound like a guillotine. My office was already stripped down. A cardboard box sat on the glass desk, holding my leather-bound notebooks, a framed photo of Kyoto, and a vintage fountain pen my mentor had given me. The staff avoided my gaze as I walked through the open-plan floor. The corporate world is allergic to failure, even when that failure is just a casualty of nepotism. They looked at their monitors, their fingers flying across keyboards, pretending the ghost of their former chief operations officer wasn't walking past their cubicles. I stepped into the elevator. The silver doors closed, reflecting my own face back at me. Tired, perhaps, but entirely calm. The descent from the 40th floor was fast, making my ears pop. With every floor we passed, I felt a layer of invisible armor shedding from my shoulders. I hit the lobby, the marble floor echoing with my footsteps. I was exactly 3 paces from the revolving glass doors that led out into the crisp, autumn air of the city when the phone in my breast pocket began to vibrate. I didn't recognize the number. It was a Washington, D.C. area code, encrypted and displaying a string of shifting alphanumeric characters instead of a name. I pulled the phone out, tapped the screen, and brought it to my ear. "This is Marcus. Marcus Vance." The voice on the other end was low, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who didn't ask questions, someone who issued directives. There was a faint hum of secure satellite interference in the background. "Speaking," I replied, pausing just before the revolving door. "This is Director Vance from the Department of Federal Logistics, Washington. We just received the electronic filing for your company's leadership transition." The man paused, and I could hear the distinct sound of a physical folder being slapped shut on a desk 300 miles away. "We only want to work with you, Marcus.
Without your oversight, the Title IX clearance for the automated supply grid is null and void. If you aren't in that chair, the contract is dead. Silence fell over the line, a heavy, absolute silence that seemed to freeze the bustling lobby around me. I looked up through the glass facade of the building, toward the top floors where Arthur and Julian were likely already uncorking a bottle of celebratory scotch. They thought they had inherited a kingdom, but they had just locked themselves inside a burning castle. "Director," I said, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across my face. "Let me tell you exactly where I am."
The glass of the revolving door reflected a man who had entered the lobby as a corporate casualty and stood there now as the single point of failure for a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Outside, the city moved in its usual frantic rhythm, yellow cabs blaring, pedestrians buried in their screens, completely oblivious to the fact that the tectonic plates of the logistics sector had just shifted beneath their feet. Director Vance's voice in my ear remained steady, a cold beacon of federal authority. "We've tracked your implementation metrics for the last 5 years, Marcus. The board thinks they bought the machine, but we know you're the only one who holds the blueprint. The Pentagon isn't shifting its automated defense supply lines to a kid whose biggest achievement is managing an Instagram account." "The transition was immediate," I said, my voice dropping an octave as a group of junior analysts hurried past me, smelling of cheap cologne and desperation. "Julian Vance is currently sitting in my chair. His father believes a bloodline is a substitute for a security clearance." A dry, humorless chuckle came through the encrypted line. "Then Arthur Vance has just committed his company to a breach of contract penalty that will liquidate his assets by midnight tomorrow. The Title IX protocol dictates that if the certified administrator is removed without a 90-day vetting period for the successor, the security escrow is frozen. Automatically." I knew the clause. I had written it into the margins of the original draft while sitting in a hotel room in Northern Virginia 3 winters ago, drinking bad coffee while the snow piled up outside. Arthur hadn't bothered to read the fine print, he had been too busy calculating his projected bonuses. "What are your instructions, Director?" I asked, leaning against a marble pillar, the cardboard box of my personal belongings tucked firmly under my left arm. "Go home, Marcus. Have a drink. Do not answer any calls from the 40th-floor exchange. We are issuing a formal notice of noncompliance to their legal department in precisely 10 minutes. Let them sweat through their bespoke suits." The line clicked and went dead. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the suffocating weight of the boardroom, but the electric stillness that precedes a lightning strike. I walked out through the revolving doors. The autumn wind hit me, crisp and sharp, cutting through the stagnant scent of corporate air conditioning. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange, intoxicating sensation. Freedom, backed by absolute leverage. I didn't take a taxi. I decided to walk the 12 blocks to my apartment. I wanted to feel the pavement beneath my feet, wanted to watch the afternoon light catch the glass towers of the financial district. By block 4, the vibrations began. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A heavy, rhythmic pulse. I pulled it out. Arthur Vance, cell. I let it ring, watching the screen illuminate the gray sidewalk until it timed out and went to voicemail. 3 seconds later, it started again. This time it was the main boardroom line. Then Julian's personal number. They were ringing in a desperate, chaotic sequence, like a dashboard lighting up when an engine loses all its oil at 60 miles an hour. They had finally opened the email from Washington. By the time I reached the lobby of my residential building, my phone had logged 17 missed calls and 4 text messages. The last text from Arthur read simply, "Marcus, back to the boardroom immediately, emergency. We need to review the Title IX addendum." I smiled at the doorman, a pleasant older man named Frank who had seen me leave at 6 a.m. every day for nearly a decade. "Early day today, Mr. Vance?" Frank asked, tipping his hat. "You could say that, Frank," I replied, stepping into the mirrored elevator. "Just taking care of some family business." Up in my apartment, the quiet was absolute. I set the cardboard box on the kitchen island and poured myself 2 fingers of neat Japanese whiskey. The ice bucket was empty, but the amber liquid didn't need it. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking back down the avenue toward the tower I had just left. Even from this distance, I could almost hear the fire alarms going off in their spreadsheets. The federal government didn't just cancel contracts, they blacklisted. If Julian and Arthur couldn't produce me in front of the Department of Logistics compliance team by the start of business tomorrow, the bank would freeze their operational credit lines. The empire Arthur had spent his life protecting was built on a foundation of government debt, and I held the only shovel. My phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was an official email notification from the firm's automated system, copy-pasting an emergency board meeting scheduled for 5:30 p.m. The description of the meeting was short. Urgent reinstatement protocols. I took a slow sip of the whiskey, the warmth blooming in my chest. They thought they could just summon me back like an old piece of software that needed a reboot. They thought a few extra zeros on a paycheck or a hollow apology over a mahogany table would make me forget the smirk on Julian's face. They were about to learn that some things are too expensive to buy back. If you want to find out how Marcus dismantles the Vance empire and forces the CEO to beg for his return, subscribe to our channel. The ice in my glass had long melted by the time the clock on my kitchen wall struck 5:45 p.m. The emergency board meeting had started 15 minutes ago, and my phone was currently vibrating so violently against the marble island that it was practically dancing toward the edge. Arthur's name flashed across the screen for the 12th time in 10 minutes. I picked it up, swiped to answer, but didn't say a word. I just listened to the ambient panic of the 40-floor boardroom bleeding through the speaker.
Marcus? Marcus, thank God. Arthur's voice was stripped of its usual corporate varnish. It sounded thin, ragged, like a man trying to talk while running up a steep hill. We have a situation here. The Department of Logistics just issued a red flag freeze on our master account. They're calling it an administrative breach. We need you back in the office right now to sign off on the transition override. In the background, I could hear the distinct sound of papers rustling and Julian's voice, uncharacteristically high-pitched, shouting at someone from legal. The transition is already complete, Arthur. I said, my voice as smooth as the silk lining of my jacket. Julian told me it was time to make room for family. I'm just respecting his wishes. I'm at home, enjoying a very fine hibiki. Marcus, stop playing games. Arthur snapped, though the anger was instantly swallowed by desperation.
They've frozen our operational credit. The automated supply grid for the eastern seaboard is going to lock up at midnight.
If that happens, we're looking at a $5 million a day penalty. The board is panicking. Then I suggest Julian starts typing, I replied. He has that brand new iPad, after all. Surely a contemporary perspective can handle a little federal compliance. A heavy, breathless silence fell over the line. Arthur knew, as well as I did, that Julian didn't even know what the acronym Title IX stood for, let alone how to bypass an encrypted federal security node. What do you want, Marcus? Arthur whispered. The proud CEO had finally vanished, replaced by a desperate father trying to stop a train wreck. Name your terms. A 20% raise. A seat on the board. Just get down here and fix this. My terms. I leaned back against the window, watching the long shadows of the city stretch across the pavement below. First, Julian leaves the building. Not just the boardroom, Arthur. I want him stripped of his security clearance, his company car, and his title. He can go back to shadowing the tech division from a coffee shop down the street. I could hear a muffled argument on the other end. Julian was screaming now, something about his inheritance and his rights. Arthur must have put his hand over the microphone, but his muffled voice was sharp, commanding his son to sit down and shut up. And second? Arthur asked, his voice shaking when he returned to the line. Second, I don't want a seat on the board, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. I want your chair, Arthur. I want a 5-year contract as managing director with total operational veto power. You can stay on as a consultant to handle public relations, but the empire belongs to the man who actually built the infrastructure. That's a hostile takeover, Marcus. The board will never approve it. Then I suggest you call the director in Washington and tell him that, I said quietly, because he's currently waiting for my personal confirmation code. If he doesn't get it by 6 p.m., the contract isn't just frozen, it's cancelled. I looked at my watch. 5:52 p.m. 8 minutes left until the digital guillotine dropped on 19 years of corporate vanity. I'll call you back in 5 minutes, Arthur. Make sure your son has his coat on. I hung up before he could answer. The silence returned, but it didn't last long. The phone was quiet for exactly 3 minutes before it began to ring again. This time it wasn't Arthur. It was a text message from the company's head of HR, marked with the highest priority flag. Attached was a scanned PDF of Julian Vance's immediate, unconditional resignation. The digital signature on Julian's resignation letter was still practically wet when I stepped back out of the elevator onto the 40th-floor executive deck. It was exactly 6:12 p.m.
The atmosphere on the floor had completely shifted. The frantic, high-velocity buzzing of 100 keyboards had died down into a tense, church-like quiet. People didn't look away this time as I walked past their cubicles. They stared open-mouthed, watching the man who had been walked out the door less than 3 hours ago return like an occupying army. I didn't carry my cardboard box back in. I left it downstairs with Frank. I didn't need it yet. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom were wide open. Inside, the scene was pure corporate carnage. Printed financial statements were scattered across the mahogany table like autumn leaves, and 3 senior board members were huddled around a speakerphone, their faces pale under the recessed LED lighting. Arthur stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked 10 years older than he had this morning. In the corner sat Julian. His bespoke jacket was draped over a chair, and his tie was completely undone. The smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, defensive glare of a child who had finally realized that his father's name couldn't protect him from gravity. "Marcus," Arthur said, turning around immediately as my footsteps echoed on the threshold. He didn't waste time with a greeting. He gestured to the phone on the table. "We have the Department of Logistics compliance officer on hold. They're 30 seconds away from executing the automatic default trigger." I walked over to the head of the table, to the chair Julian had been sitting in when he told me to make room for family. I didn't sit down. I just rested my hand on the leather backrest, looking at Arthur. "Did HR process the operational veto addendum?" I asked, my voice flat, completely devoid of the urgency that was consuming the rest of the room.
"It's signed, notarized, and uploaded to the secure server," the company's chief legal counsel spoke up from the side of the room, his hand trembling slightly as he pointed to his laptop. "You have full managing authority, Marcus, effective 5 minutes ago." I turned my gaze to Julian. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring intensely at the floor, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. "Julian," I said softly. He didn't move. "Julian," Arthur barked, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "Look at him." The kid slowly raised his head, his eyes burning with a pathetic, impotent rage. "Your Uber is waiting downstairs," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Take your iPad with you. I believe your security clearance has already been wiped from the building's mainframe." For a second, I thought he was going to say something, to throw one last tantrum, to lean on the unearned privilege that had carried him through his entire life.
But he looked at his father, saw the utter defeat written across Arthur's face, and realized he was entirely alone. Julian grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, knocked over a half-empty bottle of sparkling water as he lunged for his bag, and practically sprinted out of the boardroom. The heavy door didn't click behind him this time. He slammed it so hard the glass partition vibrated. I watched him go, then calmly pulled the boardroom speakerphone toward me and pressed the flashing red line. "Director Vance," I said into the microphone. "This is Marcus. I am back in the chair. You can release the escrow freeze." The gravelly voice of the Washington director came through the high-definition speakers, clear and commanding. "Copy that, Marcus. We see your biometric signature updating on the secure network now. The Title IX protocol is fully restored. Good to have you back at the helm." The line cut with a sharp digital chirp. An audible, collective exhale swept through the boardroom. One of the older board members actually sank back into his chair, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. The multi-million-dollar disaster had been averted with 10 minutes to spare. Arthur let out a long, shaky breath and looked at me, his shoulders slumped. "Well, you got what you wanted, Marcus. The company is yours to run. I suppose you'll want me to vacate the corner office by tomorrow morning." I looked around the room, at the expensive mahogany, the panoramic view of the city, the terrified board members waiting to see who would be the next casualty of the new regime. "No, Arthur," I said, finally sitting down in the center chair and leaning back. "You can keep your office. We have an international shipping audit next Tuesday, and I'm going to need someone to sign the coffee receipts. The transition of power in a corporate empire doesn't happen with a crown,
It happens with a keystroke.
By 8 p.m., the boardroom had emptied, leaving only the faint scent of stale espresso and panic behind. The senior board members had scurried out like mice escaping a collapsing barn, eager to look over their own department metrics before my new veto power caught up with them. Arthur had left without another word, his back slightly bent under the weight of his new reality as the most expensive administrative assistant in the city. I sat alone at the massive mahogany table. The city outside had fully transitioned into its night skin, a sprawling grid of neon, brake lights, and towering glass monoliths glowing against the dark sky. From this high up, the world looked organized, completely predictable, and entirely manageable. My phone buzzed again on the table. It wasn't a chaotic sequence of missed calls this time. It was a single, clean text message from an encrypted number. Escrow cleared, grid stabilized. Welcome to the federal tier, Marcus. First briefing is at 0600 tomorrow.
A car will be waiting downstairs. I stared at the glowing screen for a moment, then tapped a brief reply. I'll be ready. 19 years of loyal service had taught me that in the corporate ecosystem, loyalty is just a line item they delete when the budget gets tight. They thought they were playing a game of musical chairs, where the music stops and the family takes the seats. But they forgot that I was the one who had wired the sound system. I stood up, adjusting my tie in the reflection of the dark glass windows. I didn't need to pack my things anymore. The cardboard box downstairs with Frank could stay there. Tomorrow, it would be unpacked into the master suite at the end of the hall. As I walked out of the boardroom, I reached out and flipped the master light switch. The massive room plunged into darkness, the shadow of the giant mahogany table disappearing into the night. Julian had been right about one thing. It was time to make room for family. He just hadn't realized that when the federal government is counting on you to keep the country moving, you don't need a bloodline to be the one running the house. I stepped into the elevator, the silver doors closing on the 40-floor kingdom, ready for the morning. The end.